Emily Parker sat inside the courtroom with her hands tightly folded on the wooden table, her eyes lowered, her breathing slow, and her thoughts carefully controlled as though each second was part of a test she had prepared for long ago. The room around her was full, with strangers watching from the benches, their eyes fixed on her, some curious, some doubtful, some already convinced that she was the fragile person the prosecutor had just described. The judge sat tall on the bench, his expression calm and unreadable, while the prosecutor, David Miller, stood in the center of the room with the kind of confidence that came from years of victories. David was known for his sharp words, for the way he could take a story and twist it until it appeared to be the only possible truth, and today he used his voice like a blade aimed directly at Emily. She was helpless, David said loudly, letting the word echo across the quiet space. She is a woman who has lived her life leaning on others, never strong enough to face challenges on her own. When she had a chance to stand tall, she hid. When she had responsibility, she let others carry the weight. And now, in this courtroom, she wants you to believe she is different, but the truth is she has always been helpless. The jurors shifted slightly in their chairs, listening carefully, some nodding as though the words made sense. Emily's attorney, Laura Johnson, leaned closer to her and whispered, "Don't move, don't react, let him finish, he wants you to lose your calm." Emily gave the smallest nod, her lips pressing together, her fingers tightening against each other until her knuckles whitened, but her face remained steady and her body still. She had been through moments far heavier than this, nights where fear was real and danger surrounded her, times when her breath had been all she could control, and so she sat quietly now, remembering that silence itself could sometimes carry more weight than 1,000 words. David kept pacing slowly, his hands moving as he spoke, his voice filled with certainty, as if every sentence he spoke was carved into stone. He painted her as fragile, as dependent, as someone who had never made a brave choice. To him she was only a shadow of strength, a figure waiting for others to protect her, a woman incapable of leading or surviving. Yet Emily's heart told a very different story, one no one in the room seemed to know, a story she carried like a hidden flame. Years ago she had been given a call sign, a word that had nothing to do with weakness and everything to do with strength, trust, and courage. That call sign had once defined her in places where survival depended on steady nerves and quick choices, places where people had looked at her not with pity but with respect. It was strange to sit here now, being called helpless, when she had spent so much of her life proving the opposite. She wanted to rise, to speak, to show them the truth, but she also knew timing mattered more than anything. David believed he had control of the story, and she would let him believe it for a little longer, because patience was something she had mastered long before she ever stepped into this courtroom. The jury's eyes kept drifting to her, waiting for her to show some reaction, some break in the mask, but Emily stayed steady, her gaze on the polished surface of the table, her mind drifting back to memories that still lived inside her. She remembered the voices of her team calling her by that single word, that call sign, in the darkest hours of missions where every decision could mean life or death. She remembered how it had felt to be trusted, to be the one people looked to for answers, not because she was loud or powerful but because she was steady and unshaken when fear tried to overwhelm everyone else. And as she sat in the courtroom, she realized that none of these people knew that side of her. They saw only what David described, a quiet woman who seemed small under the heavy lights, but they did not know that her silence came from control, not fear. David's voice grew louder as he repeated, "She was helpless then, and she is helpless now," and he turned his gaze directly on her as though daring her to speak. But Emily did not. She let the silence answer him, because silence could be stronger than anger. Laura studied her carefully, proud that she had not cracked under the pressure, while the judge raised his brows slightly as if curious about her calm. Inside, Emily's chest rose and fell with careful rhythm, her breath steady like it had been during the longest nights when only discipline kept her alive. The people in this courtroom might not know her story yet, but she knew it, and she knew that when the right moment came and she revealed the truth about who she had been and what her call sign meant, everything David had said would lose its power. For now she waited, still and calm, while the prosecutor built his case on words that would soon crumble, because Emily Parker was not helpless, she was something far stronger, and though the world did not see it yet, they would soon. The courtroom was still heavy with silence when David Miller finally stepped back from the jury box, his words lingering in the air like smoke that refused to fade, and Emily Parker remained unmoved, her face calm though her heart carried the weight of old memories pressing against her mind. As the prosecutor paused, Laura Johnson rose slowly from her chair, adjusting her glasses and walking with quiet confidence to the center of the room, her shoes clicking softly against the floor. "Ladies and gentlemen," Laura began, her voice smooth and steady, "you have heard the picture Mr. Miller has painted of my client. You have been told she is helpless, that she has never been able to stand on her own, but what you have not heard is the truth of who she is, what she has lived through, and what she has carried on her shoulders for years. Emily Parker is not helpless. She is stronger than most of us can imagine." The jury leaned in slightly, curious now, because the woman at the table did not look like someone who had lived through extraordinary things. Emily kept her eyes down, her breath steady, but inside her mind she was pulled back to a different time, a different life, one that still seemed to live inside her like a hidden heartbeat. She remembered the training fields, the long hours of sweat and exhaustion, the voices of instructors telling her she would never make it, that she was too small, too quiet, too fragile, and she remembered the stubborn fire inside her that refused to accept defeat. She had pushed through, step by step, carrying weight on her back that felt impossible, running miles until her lungs burned, standing against challenges meant to break her spirit, and each time she had not quit. She remembered the day they finally gave her a call sign, a single word that was spoken into radios and marked her as part of a team larger than herself, a team that trusted her with their lives. That call sign was not born from pity but from respect, respect that she had earned through courage, patience, and unshakable calm under pressure. As these memories flooded her, Emily kept her face unreadable, because the time to speak had not come yet, and she knew the story would mean nothing until the moment it mattered most. Laura continued speaking, telling the jury about Emily's quiet determination, her history of perseverance, her character shaped not by weakness but by discipline. David tried to object, his voice sharp, but the judge allowed Laura to continue, and for the first time since the trial began, Emily saw a flicker of unease on the prosecutor's face. He had expected her to break, but she had not, and now the defense was beginning to place doubt in the minds of the jury. Emily's thoughts traveled again, back to the darkest mission she had ever faced, a night when everything seemed certain to collapse, when fear could have overtaken even the strongest hearts. She remembered standing in the middle of chaos, her radio alive with voices, her own call sign spoken again and again, each time not as a question but as a command, as a trust that she would guide them through. She remembered the sound of explosions far away, the sharp crack of voices demanding decisions, and the way she had kept her breath steady as she gave orders, calm and clear, carrying weight that no one in this courtroom could begin to imagine. That night had changed her, not because she wanted glory, but because she realized that real strength was not about being the loudest or the strongest, but about staying steady when everyone else was falling apart. Back in the courtroom, her hands tightened slightly on the table, not in fear but in control, and she glanced at David Miller for the briefest moment, her eyes meeting his, not with anger but with a calm certainty that unsettled him more than any outburst ever could. He looked away quickly, turning back to his notes, but Emily saw the shift. He had felt it, even if he did not yet understand what it meant. The jury saw it too, though they could not name it. The way her silence did not look like defeat but something deeper, something that suggested there was more to her story than the prosecutor wanted to reveal. Laura's words kept weaving through the air, soft but firm, building a picture of Emily that was not helpless but resilient, not fragile but patient, and though Emily herself had not spoken yet, the seeds of doubt were already planted in the minds of those who would decide her fate. As she sat there, she reminded herself of the discipline she had learned in those years past, the discipline to wait, to hold her ground, to let others underestimate her until the moment came when the truth would turn everything upside down. She knew that moment was coming, though not yet, and when it arrived, it would not just silence David Miller's sharp voice but would also open the eyes of everyone who thought they already knew her. For now, she waited in stillness, her mind moving between the courtroom and the echoes of her hidden past, a past marked by a single call sign that had once defined her life, a call sign that carried with it stories of strength and survival, stories that no one in this room could imagine but which would soon change everything. Emily Parker sat quietly in the courtroom as Laura Johnson returned to her seat, the echo of her defense still lingering in the minds of the jury, and though no one spoke, the shift in the room could be felt, a subtle change like the air before a storm, as though people were beginning to question if the picture David Miller had painted was truly complete. Emily knew better than to mistake silence for victory, but she could sense the doubt growing, and that gave her the patience to hold steady. David stood again, ready to strike back with sharper words, and he threw his gaze toward Emily as though daring her to prove him wrong, yet still she did not move, her calmness unsettling him in ways he would never admit aloud. While the trial carried on with documents, arguments, and endless discussions about her character, Emily's mind drifted once more to her past, not out of weakness but because those memories were her foundation, the invisible walls that kept her standing even as the prosecutor tried to break her down. She remembered the first day she had been called by her call sign, the moment when her instructors had stopped using her name and instead given her the word that would follow her through every mission, every order, every moment of pressure. That day had been the turning point of her life, because it was not just a title but a recognition that she belonged among the strong, that she was trusted, that she had earned a place where only the most determined survived. The call sign had been spoken in crackling radios during long nights, shouted across fields when noise swallowed every other word, whispered with respect by people who had seen her stand when others fell. It was more than a name, it was a symbol of who she truly was, and as David's voice filled the courtroom again, calling her helpless, she could almost hear the old voices calling her by that sign, reminding her of her strength. She saw herself on the training grounds, dirt on her hands, sweat burning her eyes, every muscle aching yet her will refusing to break, and she remembered the way others had started to notice, how the same people who once doubted her had begun to follow her lead. She thought of the missions where every second mattered, where she had carried more than her share, where she had stood calm while fear ran wild in the hearts of others. She remembered one night most of all, a mission that had nearly fallen apart, when her radio had come alive with desperate voices asking for direction, and it had been her call sign they repeated again and again, not because they doubted her but because they trusted her to bring them through. And she had. The memory of that night lived inside her like a flame that never went out, proof to herself that she was not the woman David described. Back in the courtroom, she pressed her hands together more tightly, her knuckles turning pale, but her face still calm, her silence still stronger than any argument David tried to build. Laura leaned closer once, whispering, "You're doing well, just hold steady," and Emily gave the faintest nod. She did not need to be told, because she knew this battle was not about shouting or reacting but about patience, the same patience that had kept her alive in harder times. The jury looked at her now with a mix of curiosity and caution, as though they sensed something deeper about her but could not yet name it, and that was enough for the moment. She let them wonder, because when the time came, she would give them the truth that no argument could erase. For now, she let David continue, let him pour out his confidence, because she knew each word he spoke without knowing her real story would only make his shock greater when the truth finally came out. Emily sat in stillness, her thoughts balancing between the past and the present, and she reminded herself that strength was not always shown in loud defiance but sometimes in waiting, in letting others underestimate you until the right moment to reveal what they never expected. Her heart beat steadily as she prepared for that moment, knowing it was drawing closer, knowing that soon she would not only speak but also remind the world of the call sign that had once carried her through the darkest nights, a call sign that would silence every doubt and end every attempt to call her helpless. The trial moved into another long day, and though hours passed with witnesses speaking, documents being read, and lawyers debating small details, the heart of the case still seemed to circle around Emily Parker herself, the quiet figure at the defense table who had yet to speak a single word. David Miller continued his work with the same sharp tone, his voice cutting through the air as he tried to convince the jury that Emily was nothing but fragile, that her silence was weakness, that her calmness was fear, and though he spoke with confidence, each time his eyes drifted toward her, he found nothing to hold on to, no crack in her posture, no tremble in her hands, no falter in her expression. Emily sat still, her hands folded neatly on the table, her gaze often lowered, her face calm, and yet her silence seemed to carry more weight than the words thrown against her. Laura Johnson, her attorney, knew that timing mattered more than anything and that their greatest weapon was not rushing but waiting until the right moment to let Emily's story come forward. So she too remained patient, defending her client with logic and reason but saving the deeper truth for when it would matter most. Emily, meanwhile, drifted again into her memories as the courtroom noise faded like background static. She remembered another night from her past, one filled with the smell of dust and the sound of strained voices calling her call sign through the radio, voices filled with both urgency and trust. That night had been one of the hardest, when everything had gone wrong, when the plan had nearly collapsed, when fear had risen in the air like smoke, but she had not broken. She had taken a breath, steadied her voice, and given clear directions that had carried her team through to safety. She remembered the way her teammates had looked at her afterward, their eyes carrying something deeper than words, a recognition that she was not weak, not fragile, not helpless, but someone who could stand when others could not. Those memories lived inside her like a foundation, stronger than any argument David could build, and though the jury did not know it yet, she carried those memories with her now, silently but powerfully. As the day wore on, David grew more frustrated, because the picture he wanted to paint of her was not taking shape the way he expected. He had imagined her breaking, imagined her voice shaking, imagined her body trembling under the weight of his accusations, but instead she gave him nothing, and that nothing unsettled him more than he cared to admit. He raised his voice louder, threw sharper words into the air, tried to pull reactions from her, but Emily simply sat still, her silence firm like stone, her patience unshaken. The jury began to notice it too, though they said nothing. The way her quietness did not look like weakness but like strength held back, waiting for the right time. Even the judge glanced at her more often now, as though wondering what lay behind the stillness. Laura caught these shifts and smiled faintly to herself, knowing the moment to let Emily speak was approaching, and when it came, the truth would turn the courtroom upside down. For Emily herself, the waiting was not a burden but a test she had prepared for her whole life, because she had learned in the hardest places that sometimes silence was the sharpest weapon of all. She sat with her memories alive in her mind, her call sign echoing like a heartbeat, her strength hidden but ready, and though David kept pressing, calling her helpless again and again, she knew the end of his confidence was near. She breathed evenly, every inhale and exhale a reminder of her control, and reminded herself that the moment would soon come when she would speak, when the call sign would be revealed, and when David Miller's voice would finally fall silent, frozen by a truth he could not fight. Until then, Emily Parker remained unshaken, her silence a wall that no accusation could break, her patience the quiet storm that was building beneath the surface of the courtroom, waiting for the final strike. The final day of the trial arrived, and the courtroom was filled with the same heavy silence that had followed Emily Parker for days, but this time there was also a quiet tension, as though everyone sensed something was about to happen that would change the direction of the case. David Miller stood once again with his usual sharp voice, repeating the same words he had used from the beginning, insisting to the jury that Emily was helpless, that she had never stood on her own, that her silence was proof of fear, not strength, and though he spoke with confidence, his eyes carried a shadow of doubt, because no matter how hard he tried, he could not break her calm. Emily sat still at the defense table, her hands folded neatly, her face composed, her breathing steady, but inside she knew the moment she had been waiting for had finally come, the moment when her silence would end, the moment when her past would step into the present and reveal the truth that no argument could cover. When David finished his closing remarks and returned to his seat with a look of forced certainty, the judge turned his gaze toward Laura Johnson, and the defense attorney rose slowly, walking to the center of the courtroom with the kind of quiet assurance that drew the attention of every eye in the room. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Laura began, her voice firm yet calm, "you have heard the prosecutor call my client helpless over and over again, but you have not heard her voice, you have not seen the truth of who she is, and today you will." She turned slightly toward Emily, nodding once, and Emily rose to her feet, her chair sliding back softly against the floor, the sound sharp in the silence of the room. For the first time, she stood before the jury, her posture steady, her eyes lifting to meet theirs, and the stillness that followed carried more weight than all the words that had filled the courtroom for days. She did not speak immediately, she simply stood there, her presence filling the space in a way that caught even David Miller off guard, because the woman before them did not look helpless, she looked composed, unshaken, and quietly powerful. Finally, Emily's voice broke the silence, calm and clear, each word measured with control. "You have been told I am helpless," she said softly, "but you do not know who I am, or what I have lived." She paused, letting her words sink in, then continued, "Years ago, I was given a call sign, and that call sign was not born out of pity or weakness, but out of trust, courage, and strength. It was a name spoken by people who relied on me when their lives were on the line, a name that carried responsibility greater than anything I face here today." The room seemed to lean forward as she spoke, the jury hanging on her words, the judge watching closely, and David Miller sitting stiffly in his chair, his confidence slipping as he realized something he had not expected was unfolding. Emily lifted her chin slightly, her voice gaining quiet strength as she said the call sign aloud, the single word that had once defined her in the darkest hours. The sound of it echoed through the room, not loud but powerful, and though the jury did not fully understand its history, they felt the weight it carried, the authority in her tone, the conviction behind it. For a moment, even David froze, his face losing its practiced confidence, his eyes blinking as though he could not believe what he had just heard. Because the call sign was known beyond Emily's memory, it was recognized, tied to records, tied to missions, tied to a history of leadership and endurance that no one could argue against. Emily did not raise her voice, she did not shout, she simply stood steady, her silence before now making her words heavier than anything David had said. "I was trusted," she continued, her voice calm, "because I never broke, because I stood when others fell, because I carried not only myself but others through the hardest nights. That call sign was my proof then, and it is my proof now. I am not helpless, and I never have been." Her eyes swept across the jury, her calm gaze holding theirs one by one, and the room remained completely silent, the weight of her words filling every corner. David shifted in his seat, trying to recover, but his frozen expression had already told the jury everything they had seen: the surprise in his face, the realization that his picture of Emily had been shattered. Laura gave the faintest smile, knowing the moment had arrived exactly as they had planned, and she stepped forward to finish the defense, but the heart of the trial was already decided, because Emily's truth had spoken louder than every accusation. She returned slowly to her seat, her body steady, her face calm, and though she said nothing more, the silence that followed was no longer the silence of a woman accused, it was the silence of respect, of recognition, of strength that no one could deny. The jury watched her with new eyes now, not as a helpless figure but as someone who had carried a hidden story, a story that explained her stillness, her patience, her refusal to break. David Miller sat stiffly, frozen in the shadow of the truth, his sharp words now hollow, and though he tried to recover in the hours that followed, the trial had already turned. The call sign had ended it all, not because it was a word, but because it was the truth behind it, the life that had earned it, the proof that Emily Parker was never helpless.